In this news roundup of the week, the 14th of October 2022, the UK government is in meltdown as Liz Truss sacks her chancellor and fights for her political survival. The country wakes up to the new hidden financial crisis that nearly bankrupted multiple pension funds. Putin's nuclear threats succeed in getting NATO governments squabbling over how to respond. And in this week's short thought, the cautionary tale of Elon Musk's forays into geopolitics. My name's Mallen Baker. This is the Mallen Baker Show. The UK government entered full meltdown mode today, with Prime Minister Liz Truss sacking her Chancellor Kwasi Kwarteng, performing a major policy U-turn and desperately hoping that it might be enough to save her premiership. The week started with one will they, won't they? Will Liz Truss and her Chancellor Kwasi Kwarteng perform a major U-turn on the mini-budget that apparently plunged the country into economic upheaval? But the will they, won't they question kind of morphed during the course of the week. Whereas last week you would have argued that however bad it looks, the one option that's not on the table is for the Conservative Party to remove Liz Truss as leader just over a month after crowning her as such in the first place. This week, a couple of poor performances later, a large proportion of Conservative Party MPs started to see the previously unthinkable, humiliating course as being the least worst option. Talks are said to be going on right now about whether MPs could undertake a rapid coronation process where maybe a joint ticket of the two highest performers in the recent contest, Rishi Sunak and Penny Mordaunt, could be pushed through by the parliamentary party without the need to go for a vote to the members. Would that save them at the next election? Well, I expect some are hoping so. Doesn't seem to be a realistic prospect, but it might reduce the size of the rout, which is what a number are most worried about. Because the political parties, the main political parties, used to have very large core voter blocks. The Conservatives had a significant chunk of the enterprise-minded middle classes. Labour had the horny-handed sons of toil, the manual labour force in other words. But in the modern era, that loyal identity-based voting bloc has eroded, and it's why the Conservatives were able to sweep to a majority last time based on getting Brexit done, attracting a lot of former Labour voters. And it's why they now fear that the hammering they're due to receive could be even worse than the one that John Major got in consequence of the Tony Blair landslide 1997. It's to fend off that logic that today Liz Truss dramatically recalled her Chancellor, who flew back from America, to sack him for carrying out the policy that they agreed together. And it's likewise to continue the fight for survival that the U-turn, part of the one anyway, was duly delivered. Will it be enough? I mean, if it turns out to be, that will make it unique in any political history that I remember living through. Because generally, by the time it's gotten to this stage, the end is inevitable, in this case likely to be pretty quick. When it comes to Liz Truss, not only does the country perceive, rightly or wrongly, that she is utterly economically incompetent, but all the areas where she sought to be distinctive are, one after the other, being U-turned on. The budget was the big one, already U-turned on the abolition of the top rate of tax, and now the corporation tax. Her government said that they weren't going to do, for instance, a public information campaign to tell people how they might save energy this winter. Too much like a nanny state government, they said. Now we hear that such a campaign is indeed being drawn up following the backlash. The UK government was appealing a court decision that it had to review its net zero plans to show properly how they would actually achieve the legally required targets and, by the way, their own stated goal. Now we hear it's dropped that appeal and will carry out a review based on intending to meet the targets. And if it's not U-turns, it's failure. Liz Truss was desperately keen there should be the signing of a major trade deal with India. According to the write-ups about it, she was so keen, she undermined her negotiating team by maintaining direct contacts with the Indian side herself. Having received the message the Prime Minister was desperate to do a deal by an imminent deadline, the Indian side just upped their demands to promote what was judged to be a wholly one-sided deal. To Truss's dismay, her team pulled the plug on the deal. Another sign of the absence of authority. Those sorts of signs tend to multiply once they've started. Another came with the news reported by the BBC that a group of senior Conservative politicians are going to call for her to resign next week. These are serious people. The PM will find it hard to survive. So could it really play out that way? That the brand new Prime Minister, within weeks of being appointed, could be defenestrated and replaced? I mean, it's a breathtaking and surreal prospect, but no less so than what's already happening. One might say that it was all self-inflicted, wholly unnecessary. All a new leader needed to do was execute on the 2019 manifesto that got the party elected, to do so more competently and without scandal to distinguish itself from the previous incumbent. Liz Truss apparently made a good first impression just by turning up at Prime Minister's questions and actually, answering questions. The bar was set pretty low for an easy honeymoon period. And then if you wanted to strike out a bolder direction, draw up your plans for the next manifesto, take it to the people. Because, as a number of people have noted, there is a real democratic deficit in what's just happened, and that would be the case even if it hadn't gone massively wrong. Changing a leader mid-term is one thing. Events come along and sometimes it has to be done. The British system is a parliamentary one, not a presidential one. So that alone doesn't require a new election. But that rather breaks down if a new leader decides immediately to strike out in radical directions that are not representative of the manifesto the party was elected on. Then you're left with the question that is now increasingly being asked. Who voted for this? Now, does that mean that all of this is the fault of Liz Truss and Kwasi Kwarteng? Once they're replaced, everything will calm down again? Maybe. Some of the market reaction seems unreasonable in any case. Other countries are carrying bigger deficits than the UK that are not penalised for it. Others follow similar policies to what they tried in ways that are tolerated. Partly it was purely because the markets were taken by surprise and because some rather unfortunate presumptions of the amount of credibility post-Brexit Britain could still command without actually spelling out the detail of how it was going to balance the books. But there's more to it than that. A significant part is because there is a real structural economic crisis based once again on major bad practice in the city. And that won't simply go away whoever's in charge. So let's look at that. There's no doubt that Truss and Kwarteng made some extremely public missteps, but was that caused by being generally clueless as their opponents suggest, or because of a situational awareness gap that was actually true for most politicians and economists? Let's put it this way. Within a couple of days of Kwarteng's mini-budget, a number of pension funds were close to collapse. You can put all of that on him, but does he have that much power? You should ask yourself, how could it be these incredibly important parts of a financial system upon which many retired people depend could be so quickly pushed to the brink like that? Wouldn't you expect the system to be a little more robust? Well, let's see if we can do the quick explanation on how it works and how it's gone wrong. It starts with these things called gilts. Gilts are how the government borrows money. Say they decide to borrow £1 billion. They issue £1 billion of gilts. Investors, including pension funds, buy those for £1 billion. The government then pays twice yearly interest payments before then paying back the amount that was borrowed after a fixed period of time. So you get 5, 10, 30, 50-year gilts. In normal times, these are good for pension funds because they have a stable, reliable source of interest payments to fund the payments to retirees on their schemes. Simple, right? However, there is no simple process that the market will not make complicated in the search for greater returns. So firstly, gilts get bought and sold on the secondary market. The price of those gilts can go up or down depending on demand. That demand is affected by things like how much inflation is pushing prices up, whether the investors have confidence that the government will be able to pay back the full debt, how many gilts the government's issuing, how much money it's trying to borrow. So if the owner of some gilts decides they want to sell, they may find the market isn't willing to pay full price for those gilts. They might sell them instead for, say, 80% of the original price. So while the gilts might have been paying 2% interest on that original price for the new owners, it's now paying 2.5% interest because they paid a lower price. The government pays the same interest regardless of who owns the gilts and how much they actually paid for them. So this is what just happened. UK gilts started the year with 10-year gilts, for instance, paying around 1.3% interest. That was based on the market prices that people were paying for them. Then Kwasi Kwarteng came along with his mini-budget, in which the government flagged a massive amount of spending and tax cuts with a big black box with to be decided on the question of how it would be paid for medium term. After that had sunk in, the fact the government would be borrowing so much money with so little apparent care as to the fundamentals underpinning it, the prices of gilts in the market plummeted to the degree that yields on gilts went up from that 1.3% to 4%. Now you might ask, well, why would that bother the government? I mean, that's the secondary market. They can still sell their gilts and pay their interest. Why should they care about that resale value? Well, obviously, if I'm looking to buy gilts and I can buy them cheaper in the market with a 4% rate of return, I'm not going to buy them directly from the government for a 1.3% rate of return. So that forces the government to increase the interest that they pay on new gilts to match the market, which of course pushes up the cost of government debt. You might say, well, okay, that's a pain in the backside for government. Maybe you feel it's well deserved. Although it feeds through to us, of course, in the end, in terms of taxes and so on. But why does that push the pension fund industry to the edge of a mortal crisis? Well, did I mention the whole part about the market making things more complicated? During the years where interest rates have been at historic lows, pension funds had to buy more 30-year gilts to get the interest payments that they needed. Now, they did this with what's called a derivative, something specifically called liability-driven investments. They used borrowed money to get gilts while freeing up their own funds to invest in higher-paying stocks and shares. Now, that was fine while gilt prices were relatively high and the interest rates were stable, but it made them highly vulnerable to sudden change. So gilt prices in the market just collapsed. The lenders of the money the pension funds used for the gilts now looking at the funds and see that they're holding a bunch of gilts that are no longer worth what they borrowed. So they start demanding that the pension funds deposit cash to prove that they can afford their losses and that they'll be able to repay them the full amount. How does the pension fund get that cash? Well, it can only be by selling more gilts. And lots of pension funds doing that means, yes, you guessed it, the price of gilts goes down even further, compounding the problem. Eventually, the Bank of England stepped in, saying that it would buy billions of pounds worth of gilts, pushing those prices back up, trying to stabilise the market by taking off the pressure. But that was only a brief intervention that was due to finish today. On Tuesday this week, the bank said that it was still intending to stop doing that on the day that this video is being shot. So will chaos re-ensue? Will the bank backtrack and extend its intervention? Will the government's moves make a difference? We will see. One commentator, Ross Clark, wrote this in The Telegraph yesterday. If we reach the end of capitalism, it won't be because the world's remaining Marxists have won the argument. It will be because too many people have lost their pensions due to the incompetence of the people who are running them. We will be hearing about this, more to come. Meanwhile, in Ukraine this week, President Putin has been responding to the highly symbolic and temporarily practical win of the bombing of the Crimea Bridge, and that response has come in the form of missile and drone attacks on civilian targets, along with critical infrastructure. While recent Ukrainian counterattack progress has been the main source of focus for many, intelligence reports also report that Russian forces are making slow progress in the central Donbass region, where the private Wagner group is heavily involved. Elsewhere, progress is being hampered by shortages of munitions and manpower. And as for that counterattack, Moscow has said that it would help people to leave Kherson in recognition of the fact that Ukrainian gains there are likely to continue in the short term. In the meantime, Putin's threat of the use of nuclear weapons paid him at least some dividends this week, as Western leaders fell out publicly over what should be done if he does. It started with President Biden warning of potential nuclear Armageddon, which quickly had to be clarified with the US's allies that the comments weren't based on specific new intelligence that such weapons were about to be used. Biden said, "I don't think there's any such thing as the ability to easily use a tactical nuclear weapon and not end up with Armageddon." He was then publicly rebuked for the comments by French President Emmanuel Macron, who said, "We must speak with prudence when commenting on such matters." But then, of course, he went further and said specifically that France would not respond with a nuclear strike if Putin crossed the nuclear line. That led him to be rebuked by British Defence Secretary Ben Wallace, who criticised him for breaking the careful policy of ambiguity over how the West might respond and showing his hand. Mind you, Macron is probably focused on his own problems right now. He's trying to face down a major strike of oil industry workers, which today left 2,500 petrol stations without fuel. And in a couple of weeks' time, he will be trying to get next year's budget through a parliament where he has no majority. In an attempt to get it through anyway, this may turn into a confidence vote that could conceivably see a snap general election, one that he would enter with no guarantees of success. He must be feeling slightly envious, therefore, of Chinese Premier Xi Jinping, who next week, barring some remarkable deviation from expectations, will be granted a third term, breaking the previous two-term limit, effectively granting him leadership for life. Bearing in mind that at 69 years old, that could mean 5 years, or it could mean 30. Given the controversies and difficulties around President Xi's zero COVID policy, some had wondered if this would be the moment that opposition forces would move to prevent it happening. It's rather a now or never moment. Most experienced commentators seem united on the view such an outcome is pure wishful thinking, and Xi Jinping remains pretty solidly in control of the machinery of the state. So people were left instead to get excited about an isolated but extremely brave protest by an individual citizen who hung banners on the Sitong Bridge in Beijing. One of the banners read, "We want food, not PCR tests. We want freedom, not lockdowns. We want respect, not lies. We want reform, not a cultural revolution. We want a vote, not a leader. We want to be citizens, not slaves." The protest was quickly dealt with. Chinese social media had to respond to the viral posts on it by removing them, banning certain keywords, and then as people evaded those with phrases such as "I saw it," those went as well. More significant, the scene continues to be set for what will come after Xi is confirmed and safe in his position. President Biden this week named China the most consequential geopolitical challenge for the West. And that was rather underlined by the head of the UK's GCHQ, Sir Jeremy Fleming, who warned that Beijing is building a powerful anti-satellite system designed to deny other countries access to space if there is a conflict. As more and more systems become dependent on satellites, including, of course, battlefield intelligence, they become a potent target that could have massive consequences if taken down at scale. The Beidou satellite system could also be used to track individuals anywhere in the world, potentially representing, quote, a huge threat to us all. China, he said, is learning the lessons from Russia's war in Ukraine and is pushing ahead with things like its central digital currency, which will aim to monitor the bank transactions of all users, but to some degree also to defend itself against financial sanctions should a conflict take place. That said, if China wants to dominate the world, there are plenty who think that all it has to do is sit back and let the West rip itself apart. In the week that Joe Biden said that if Donald Trump stands again, he too will stand again, because he believes he can beat him a second time. A scenario that the large majority of Americans really don't want to see. And in the week that the January 6th committee announced that it would subpoena Trump in its continuing work to seek to undermine his ability to lead the next charge, which is going to just rile the other side up even more, it certainly doesn't look like a country that Xi Jinping will feel can't be outsmarted and outmaneuvered. Right now, if reality was a Netflix series, you'd have to conclude that this was the season after they'd fired all the competent writers. There's a well-known phenomenon where someone who is an authority in one area comes to presume they're an expert in other areas where they actually have zero experience whatsoever. In science, it's seen often enough, it's become much remarked. Physicists are reportedly particularly guilty of it. So much so, the dialogue was immortalised in an XKCD cartoon that is much tweeted and retweeted in the scientific community. You're trying to predict the behaviour of insert complicated system. Well, just model it as a insert simple object, then add some secondary terms to account for insert complications I just thought of. Easy, right? Why does your field need a whole journal anyway? So that's science. And then there's Elon Musk and geopolitics. Elon Musk is, of course, just the latest of the tech billionaires to decide that they need to save the world from non-tech related problems. The history of this mindset's easy to forget, but the internet did genuinely revolutionise the world. All sorts of things that were inefficient and slow were transformed by coding geeks who came to believe in their own brilliance and their ability to reinvent any process to make it 10 times better. Which for a lot of business processes and products they did. Hence their billions, which came as a result of that success. Then Bill Gates decided that the same problem-solving approach could do a better job of solving some of the world's other problems. Partly he was right. I mean, ignore some of the wild stories that are not based on fact. Some of the work of the Gates Foundation did identify basic important things that international aid bureaucracies often missed. And there was a real value in asking harder questions about what works and what doesn't. But then it goes beyond all that, and you start to see the emergence of the technocratic, overconfident would-be geniuses who end up thinking they are effortlessly ahead of everyone else, and they don't therefore bother to put the work in. Some of them led the organisations that directed how the world was going to ensure that COVID vaccines were made available to poorer countries, and they wholly failed. And now we have Elon Musk. Firstly, he has a product and he spots a need. Ukraine's invaded by Russia, which attacks some of its communications infrastructure. So Musk appears with Starlink satellites, provides internet connectivity for Ukraine. Everyone thinks that's appropriate. It's a good job, especially the Ukrainians. Well, then he starts putting forward his opinion about peace plans. He's a businessman, he's a deal maker, so he knows, he thinks, better than all of those deadweight politicians and diplomats, that the war will only end when a deal is struck. Which means sooner or later Ukraine will have to concede territory. If it's sooner, then it means that fewer people will die. Oh, and he has genius thoughts about Taiwan as well. Like maybe China can give them special status so that they agree to be absorbed. More lenient special status, he said, than Hong Kong has. You mean like Hong Kong actually had when it was handed over by the British to China, the lenient agreement that was then overturned once Hong Kong's economy had become just a fraction of that of mainland China's rather than the major component that it started off as. Unsurprisingly, Russia and China have been big fans of these contributions, Ukraine and Western politicians less so. One Ukrainian ambassador told Elon Musk to F off. A few days later, he was signalling to the US government that SpaceX wouldn't fund the Starlink service for Ukraine anymore, so would they be prepared to pay for it instead? When someone commented linking the two events, Musk rather confirmed it by saying they were just doing what they'd been advised. This is serious amateur hour stuff, which should surprise nobody. Geopolitics and business, they have some overlaps. They are nowhere near to being the same thing. The tech billionaires discovered and demonstrated to the world how much you can achieve if you have a can-do attitude and a fake-it-till-you-make-it approach. Well, arguably that gave us social media that polarises people, online financial systems that think they can give you on-the-spot fines for opinions they don't like. There have been amazing advances which we've all benefited from, but there's a lot of hubris as well. And nothing has proven quite so hubristic as the technocratic mindset that says, we're just so good at this, we hardly even have to put the work in anymore to understand a thing before we can improve that thing. Maybe that's the spirit of the age that we're now creating, but the old way of establishing a wealth of institutional knowledge based on accumulated experience and building on top of that, rather than thinking that everything can be invented from scratch all the time, there's a lot to be said for that as well. People who revolutionised their field, who broke the rules, the likes of Picasso in the arts or Einstein in the sciences. They profoundly understood the rules of their field before breaking some of them. You have to see the world clearly in order to change it. Otherwise, you just end up like the two-dimensional fool in the cartoon. All right, my thanks as always to the people who support this channel on Patreon. You know the score. I simply could not do what I do here without that support. If you would like to add yours for the independent, fact-focused and non-ideological content I aim to produce here, please head on over to patreon.com/Mallen Baker. It is really very much always appreciated. Either way, have a great week. My name's Mallen Baker. This is the Mallen Baker Show. Thanks for watching this video. If you liked it, please share with anyone else you think would also enjoy it. Word of mouth is really important to us. And if you've not subscribed yet, what are you waiting for? As the saying goes, that subscribe button won't smash itself.